Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Heather Hoffman. I'm the federal liaison between the WestFAST and the Western States Water Council and host of today's presentation. Please note this webinar will be recorded and posted to the WestFAST tab found on the Western States Water Council webpage at westernstateswater.org. So feel free to share that link with those who cannot participate today. This webinar is part of a special webinar series on wildfire, communities, and water resources, which will culminate in a panel discussion at the Western States Water Council meeting this fall to discuss where we go from here. Today's presenters are Christy Swartz and Stephen Elmore with the Office of Wildland Fire in the Office of the Secretary at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Stephen Elmore is a senior U.S. government manager with more than 24 years of experience in budget, policy, and administrative operations. He has worked in the executive and legislative branches of the federal government and in the nonprofit sector. Currently, as budget officer with the Office of Wildland Fire, Stephen coordinates the formulation and execution of a $1.3 billion annual budget for the Department of the Interior's Wildland Fire Management Program. The program also received $1.5 billion through the bipartisan infrastructure law to supplement annual funding for 22 to 26. In addition to budget duties, he facilitates strategic planning and performance measurement for the wildland fire management. Stephen previously served in the Office of Management and Budget, the House of Representatives, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Treasury. He also served as director of the nonprofit Maryland Budget and Tax Policy Institute. Stephen received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the Transylvania University in his home state of Kentucky and a Master's of Public Policy degree from Duke University's Samford School of Public Policy. Christy Swartz coordinates the fuels management and post-fire programs as the Wildland Fire Program Specialist in the Department of the Interior's Office of Wildland Fire. Christy grew up on a dairy farm in Western Oregon, which resulted in a love of the outdoors. She majored in biology. In college, she started fighting fire with the Forest Service while still in school. She is now starting her 27th year working in federal wildland fire management and has worked for the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management along the way. So before I hand it over to them, I want to let you know that we will take questions at the end of today's presentation. You'll be able to use the chat feature or simply unmute yourself to speak. If as we go along and you have a question, you can capture it in the chat and I'll be happy to read it aloud at the end of the presentations. So with that, I'll pass it on to our presenters.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And please let me know if you can see the slides.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So it's great to be with you today. Christy and I have become a sort of a team for these kind of presentations. She knows the program side and I know some about the budget side, so hopefully it will be informative. And as Heather said, if you have questions, please, you can put them in the chat, and it's fine to wait to the end, but if you have something that's just burning in your mind while we're discussing, it's also fine to ask during the discussion. So we're going to give you some background on the Wildland Fire Management Program in Interior specifically, then a budget overview. We're also going to talk about how the bipartisan infrastructure law enacted in November is affecting our program, as well as actually the Forest Service Wildland Fire Management. We'll talk about some priorities through that law over the next 5 years, and then the role of partnerships in the program. First of all, many of you may be familiar, but the Interagency Wildland Fire Management comprises the Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and Interior. And within Interior, four bureaus are the major participants. We do have others such as Geological Survey and other offices within Interior that participate. In terms of funding, though, primarily it flows through our four bureaus: Bureau of Indian Affairs, Land Management, National Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service. Then we are in the Office of Wildland Fire, which is part of the Office of the Secretary. I haven't seen the figures lately, but when I started with Interior about a year and a half ago, the one way to think about it is the Forest Service is the big player in terms of dollars, 3 to 4 times the funding of our wildland fire management. And Interior, however, has 3 to 4 times the land. I think that's roughly correct. So obviously forested landscapes are what's important in Forest Service. Forested landscapes make up some of Interior lands, but also non-forested landscapes are the more substantial part. The National Cohesive Strategy, I think, Christy, you can probably tell more about the background on that.
Sure. So in 2009, Congress directed us to develop a cohesive strategy, and the result was this all lands strategy, a strategic approach to wildland fire response, but not just response that we've. So the vision that's on the screen: safely and effective extinguish fire where we need to, use fire where we can, manage our natural resources in a nation, live with wildland fire. So it has the three primary goals under there: restore and maintain resilient landscapes, ensure we have fire adapted communities, and a safe and effective wildfire response. So again, this is not just DOIs, this is all lands, and it's intended to incorporate state, private, tribal lands as well. So really kind of those three primary goals, though, kind of center and focus the how we manage fire and how we think about fire. Okay. And then I'll talk about this next one as well. So breaking that down, so this is DOI centric. Forest Service has similar parallel programs as well, but we really think about it in three phases. So before, during, and after a fire. So preparedness and fuels management, fire science before a fire, during. So when you think about wildfires, you probably think about the during part. So suppression, operations, response, emergency stabilization, which is also commonly referred to as burned area emergency response. And of course, fire science is a piece of that as well. And then burned area rehabilitation. In Department of Interior, we have a longer term post-fire recovery program. And that's our longer term post-fire program, is the burned area rehabilitation. And then of course, fire science as well is a piece of that, to understand what works and what doesn't work in post-fire recovery, so that we can continuously improve. Next slide. Okay, so preparedness. So again, this is part of that pre-fire program. This is really resources, engines, helicopters, ensuring that we have people that are in place and ready to respond to fires when they occur. We work across jurisdictions. So this goes kind of tears back to that cohesive strategy, making sure that we're coordinating with our partners, so that we know who's going to respond to a fire, where and when. It's not uncommon in DOI lands that we have this really kind of mixed or checkerboard ownership pattern, or small units. Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service have some really small individual units that really rely on their partners to respond effectively. So preparedness funds those core firefighting resources, hiring, training, ensuring folks are ready to go when we do have fires. And then also the assets, like the engines and the helicopters, those kinds of things are part of it. And then the picture is of an all-women crew out of Yosemite. So the nexus to water here. So predictive services, climate, seasonal severity, relative to looking backwards and thinking about historic conditions, past conditions, and where we've had large fires is a big part of preparedness. That includes weather, drought monitoring, forecasting, water source mapping as a point for helicopter dipping, those kinds of resource mapping, and then fuels management to mitigate fire impacts, such such as severity, thinking about impacts to water specifically, and pre-planning so that we've got some of those considered early on. Head, Stephen. Okay, so next one, suppression operations. So again, this is probably what folks that really think of when they think about fire is when there's particularly large fires. On the bright side, we catch more than 97% of all fires when they're really small and nobody ever hears about them. But we do manage every fire. Every fire gets a response. And again, back to that all hands, all lands response. So when, particularly for smaller units where we work closely with partners, and then as fires grow large and they tend to not stick with our jurisdictional boundaries. So working with partners as fires grow, to ensure that we're protecting the values that need protected. And then emergency stabilization. So again, that post-fire, it is a post-fire response, but it's included in the suppression operations, to ensure that we're mitigating potential post-fire flooding issues when we can, taking actions to replace key infrastructure that was lost during fires when it's generally on federal land. Those are our constraints. Kind of some of the nexus to water again. So weather forecasting during an actual event. Are there storms coming in that are going to impact fire response or our ability to get out of the area? I've been on a few fires where too much water is the issue with leaving. And avoiding transmission of aquatic invasives during fire response. Location of ponds, but also in places of where there's aquatic invasives and places where there aren't. So making sure we're not transmitting those back and forth between those water sources. And then post-fire, in that emergency stage, really thinking about what we can do to mitigate post-fire flooding, if we can, and or ensuring that there's notifications out to folks who might be impacted by post-fire flooding, erosions, mudslides, some of those kinds of things. Next slide. All right, fuels management. So this is kind of my key area, focus area. And here we're really working to manage vegetation to reduce fire impacts and protect values at risk before a fire happens. We want to improve climate resilience. So as we see longer fire seasons, hotter days, what opportunities do we have to affect our environment and learn to adapt to climate change? Some of what the tools that we use are prescribed fire. Those are probably what you see the most of or hear the most about. But we also do mechanical, chemical, and biological treatments. So mechanical, from thinning, understory, tree removal to mastication, grinding up vegetation. Chemical herbicide applications are used, particularly in areas where we have invasive species that drive our fires, and that's pretty common for our DOI lands, many of our DOI lands that we manage. And then biological, we do use insects sometimes for invasive species, but this is really thinking more typically about grazing. So it could be cows, but also goats, some of those kinds of biological treatments where they're managing the vegetation for us. And then we're continuing to learn and apply tribal ecological knowledge as we come to understand it. And this particular photo is from the Pueblos burning on the Santa Fe National Forest. It's part of this. Right, next slide. So burned area rehabilitation. Again, this is that longer term post-fire recovery. The bar, we call it bar, but the bar for implementing it is that we want to repair or improve those landscapes that are unlikely to recover without our assistance. If so, the teams that go do post-fire assessments do an assessment, and then they decide whether or not it's likely to recover on its own. If so, we're not going to take any action. If it's not likely to move forward, then we'll take actions to work to help it get started. So that's a key feature. We do have funding in DOI for up to 5 years. It's been relatively, when Stephen will talk about this soon, has not received a ton of funding in the previous years, but under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have some increased support there. And then one of the key features is it's to prevent further degradation of watersheds and landscapes. So similar to fuels, it's working to mitigate the impacts from fire, but of course, this is after a fire's already occurred. The impact to watersheds and water. So the emergency stabilization piece really focuses on that post-fire flooding component. This is more smaller impacts or longer term impacts so that the landscape can recover and filter water normally. It can include some culvert replacements, longer term needing planting, erosion control type of efforts to stabilize those landscapes. Next slide. I think this next one you've got, Stephen.
So another smaller part of our budget goes to facilities, construction and maintenance for specifically here, the fire related facilities, so the program facilities. And as you would expect, the goal is just to make sure that we have safe, functional and energy efficient facilities. It includes things like this aircraft hangar pictured here, which is a Fish and Wildlife Service hangar. It also includes types of lodging, which vary by bureau. And the program has specialists in facilities who tie in with the Bureau's other facilities planning, and they regularly produce a 5-year deferred maintenance and capital improvement plan. One thing we're thinking about with the infrastructure law, which we'll talk more about, is the need for lodging in particular as we expand the number of firefighters, that will grow, but also other facilities that support them. So it is a small part of our budget, but it's also an important one. Let's see. And then the Joint Fire Science Program is it's joint with the Forest Service. And this program is intended to fund dedicated research and science that helps inform the wildland fire management decisions. It is a network of different exchanges, as well as a very important employer for graduate students who are interested in land management. Some current priority areas of research are mental health of firefighters, smoke emissions and their effects, be it from wildfire or from prescribed fires. And then the emphasis in the current administration being very heavy on climate change and its effects, a lot of climate science, so carbon storage and cycling, resilience to the effects of climate change, and also an area of emphasis of this administration, which is understanding the effects of wildfire on different populations. To give you a budget overview, for those of you familiar with the federal budget, we typically talk about funding being either discretionary or mandatory. And on mandatory, sometimes people use shorthand of entitlement spending. Mandatory is, once it's enacted, it continues until and unless there's a change. And so you could think about there like certain social service programs that have eligibility requirements. Sometimes people say that that side of the budget is on autopilot, which is not strictly true. But our funding falls on the discretionary side of the budget. It is appropriated each fiscal year, but the funding that we have is called no-year funding. It's available until we spend it, which is important for a program like this, so that we don't have kind of what might be artificial deadlines at the end of a fiscal year, where there might be a flurry of activity to ensure that we can spend some funding. It's also particularly useful because our program reaches the height of fire season or the fire year in the summer into the early fall, But then we have a lot of spending that occurs in what is the first quarter of the federal fiscal year, October through December. But a lot of that spending actually is still on the fire suppression that occurred in the prior fiscal year that had just ended. We do currently have roughly $1 billion in regular appropriations in 21 and 22. The president's budget proposes an increase that I'll show you for 23. And that's kind of like our base funding. In terms of personnel, we have above 5,000. It does vary by year, and also the time of year matters a great deal. We tend to reach our peak employment in the summer. And as you would imagine, we have a mix of permanent and temporary employees. And within the permanent, some of them are full-time year-round, others are career seasonal. So it's quite a mix. You probably understand the congressional appropriations process, so we'll skip ahead, but we wanted to highlight for you that our funding is made available slightly different than might be the case with some of the other funding that the Bureaus of Interior receive. So once OMB apportions the funding that's been enacted, it flows through us to what we call the parent account for wildland fire management. And we in OWF consult with the bureaus. We use some ongoing formula or methodology that takes into account the size of the, especially labor spending in each of the bureaus, but also some priorities that are common within the program, but maybe one or more bureau or office may provide services to the others. So we take all of that into account and then allocate the funding to the bureaus. They then allot it to regional offices or state offices, depending on how they're structured in the bureaus. And then from there, it goes to the field. So there are a few more steps in particular than the Forest Service has in terms of how we allocate funding in Interior. The 23 budget requests I mentioned for fiscal year 23, which is the fiscal year that will begin in October. We sometimes call these in Interior the green books. So our green book for 2023 proposes that our major account, the Wildland Fire Management account, be 1.2 billion, which is a sizable increase above the 22 enacted level that I just showed you. Most of this increase is slated for preparedness and fuels management. Preparedness is where most of our personnel are funded, but not all. And so therefore, you can imagine the budget proposes major increases for firefighting workforce. And as I said, fuels management. We also have a suppression reserve fund that Congress enacted several years ago. We and the Forest Service have some transfer authority within each department, but also between the two departments to help meet needs, especially for suppression funding. But those can be quite disruptive to other operations, and we're consistently not meeting the needs in a timely way without a huge disruption. So a few years ago, Congress agreed on a multi-year plan that we're now in the midst of to provide funding through a discretionary cap adjustment, which if you're a budget geek or you just pay attention over time, you would know that a cap adjustment usually means, okay, Congress has decided there's a discretionary cap on spending, but they make an exception or an adjustment to it for certain types of spending. And this one is that case, which is because it's such a high priority and kind of relates to national emergencies. It is therefore done through a discretionary cap adjustment that both chambers and the executive branch agreed. And the current plan provides us access to another $340 million through this reserve fund in years when our regular suppression funding is not enough, and it has not been enough for quite some time. So this provides a lot of cushion, and there is a process by which we notify Congress before we access the reserve fund. It has been in place a few years, and so far it has reduced the disruption to other activities in both departments when suppression funding needs are very high. This is a look at a table that shows you a comparison of this is just the regular funding, not the infrastructure funding. It shows it by activity or sub-activity, which are the major categories that Congress appropriates the funding for. It gives you an idea of the relative level of spending. So preparedness and suppression operations are typically our two biggest areas. Fuels management is the next largest, and it is also an area that Congress the last few years has consistently increased funding for, including through disaster supplemental funding and most recently infrastructure law. Christy mentioned that the burned area rehabilitation program has been relatively small until recent infrastructure law and disaster funding. The disaster funding I'm referring to is one-time funding that both fuels management and BAR received this year. And then there you also see facilities funding. The 23 budget proposes a reduction in facilities funding, largely because the bureaus have built up sizable unobligated balance. And so there's an effort to spend that down and execute more timely before we ask Congress for additional funding. And then joint fire science, this shows our contribution to that, $4 million. So taken together, we are at about $1.3 billion this year between the reserve fund and the wildland fire management. But then the proposal is about 1.5 billion for 2023. Let's see, Christy, were we going to switch here, or I'll do this one, I guess. Sorry, I can't see our notes. So we mentioned the infrastructure law. This was enacted in mid-November, and it's very sweeping, as you're no doubt familiar with. For our program in Interior, it appropriated almost 1.5 billion. So roughly the level we're asking for in 2023, the infrastructure law provided, but over 5 years. As with our regular funding, it is parceled out over the 5 years by Congress. With we have access to a larger share up front, but it is called Know Your Funding. It does not expire, so it's available until it's needed and expended. Congress made available roughly 400 million of the total this year. We have not been able to allocate that much. It is you know, a marathon, not a sprint in terms of implementing it. But we are now well above 100 million. I think it's more like 160 million that we've allocated so far from the parent account to the bureaus, working with them to implement the law's provisions. And then in each of the following 4 fiscal years, this infrastructure law funding will be a total of up to 260 million each of those years available. We're seeing a ramp up this year that will continue next year before we kind of reach the full implementation.
And do you have discretion about which area that money goes into? Like compared to the last slide of the facilities and BAR and fuels management, where does the 1.5 billion go? Which line does that go in?
So actually, that's a great segue. I think, Christy, were you going to take it from here to address that question with the
I guess
purposes?
I should wait and let you.
Yep.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
That's what
it's a good question.
Yep. So out of the one, it's 1.458 to be really precise, but so 245 million is going to what we would describe as preparedness. A large percentage of that is going to work for what we also describe as workforce, and it's for compensation. So there was for firefighters, there was a requirement in the law that we increase firefighter salaries by at least by 50% or $20,000, whichever was less. As Stephen mentioned, we have a lot of temporary and seasonal firefighters who are not paid very well. So they would receive up to a 50% increase. For staff who are paid a little bit better, they would receive up to a $20,000 increase. The funding, DOI received 120 million of that within the preparedness line item for that particular piece. It looks like we'll have that fully expended within 2 years. The other components that are included within that preparedness, and I'm probably not going to get them all, but there's a few. There's remote sensing for kind of thinking about where fires are going to occur. There's remote sensing for thinking where fires have occurred, so detecting smoke columns or post-fire flooding as well. So there's some remote sensing technologies, funding for NOAA to support some of this technological development and assessment. There's funding for slip-on tanks. So we put tanks on the back of pickup trucks, but this is for non-federal staffs, so outside of us, to provide a grant program to non-federal communities to upgrade their equipment to respond. And I think there's one more, but that's generally what's included in that preparedness element. So fuels management, we have 878 million. Of course, that's over 5 years. So it's, what is that, 200 million-ish a year, a little less year over year. And that it's a little more prescriptive than our normal fuels management for DOI. Our normal fuels management is just fuels management, and we implement it using prescribed fire, mechanical, biological, as I talked about earlier. This is more prescriptive, and there's specific items directing us to work on prescribed fire, potential control location or fuel breaks, thinning, biomass removal, and additionally, it directs us to work in areas that are at very high hazard and or potentially more interest to you, areas that provide public drinking water sources. So that's one nexus here. And then post-fire recovery is actually, well, for the pieces that I manage, the most significant increase. Again, typically we get about 20 million a year. That's been relatively flat, except for this year, over the past 10 years. So we've been sitting at about 20 million a year for that long-term post-fire recovery. And this provides 325 million over 5 years. So it's a tripling-ish of our normal allocation for post-fire recovery and burn area rehabilitation. So substantial investment in that. And then Joint Fire Science, $10 million over 5 years. That's not quite doubling, but it's roughly a double what they have historically received. So pretty substantial increase for science investment. And Joint Fire Science is really helpful in that they reach out, work with the scientists to develop new science, but also do a really great job of communicating back with managers on what the implications are for management. Sometimes, from my perspective, the science goes into that really science bucket, and we as managers aren't necessarily able to use that or apply it to work we're doing. So they do a great job of transferring that information to managers. Next slide, Stephen. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Actually, one thing I can add is that unlike some recipients of infrastructure law funding, in our program, Congress provided it through for the most part, our existing structure, our existing activities, albeit with a lot of strings and requirements and authorized purposes and authorized funding levels. But as Christy described, it falls into our existing program. But whereas many parts of the department are looking at new programs or new activities in a much more significant way. We do have to be mindful of there's no danger of running afoul of augmenting our basic appropriation, because again, if they provided it through our existing appropriation, but there, as you can imagine, there's much more tracking, and there'll be special auditing and reviews on the infrastructure law funding. So we have to be able to say, you know, this dollar that we're spending in this place, it's consistent with the purposes of the infrastructure law.
So priorities, implement the infrastructure law. So we really want to transform the wildland over the next 5 years, transform the wildland fire management program and wildfire risk so that we can adapt to this changing climate. Suppression, always ensuring that we have adequate resources and they're able to timely respond. Firefighters improve their compensation. Mental health and well-being is a big component of supporting our wildland firefighters this year, and then ensuring that there's professional development opportunities so that there's a path forward for folks that start at that ground level. And then really working, because we have historically relied on temporary workforce, there's an emphasis in shifting folks towards permanent workforce. That the difference there is small from a but from a people perspective, it's significant in that temporary employees aren't entitled to benefits or many benefits, and so permanent employees receive full benefits, including retirement and some of those kinds of things. So it's from a person perspective, it's a really important change. Fuels management and burn area rehabilitation, changing the impacts, changing risk before a fire, and then setting landscapes on the path to recovery after a fire, so that we can reduce wildfire risk in the longer term. Fire science, expanding research, particularly related to climate resilience. And then I think also community resilience, thinking about underserved communities and ensuring that they've got, that we're putting the right treatments in the right place to help communities in a fair and balanced way. And partnerships. So we'll talk more about that on the next slide, but really we want to increase and enhance consultation, collaboration, and specifically for DOI, because Bureau of Indian Affairs is a part of our department. There's an additional emphasis on working with tribal nations. Okay, so these are not a comprehensive list of our partners, but some of the biggest ones that we work with. Forest Service, as Stephen mentioned, we receive parallel allocations and do a lot of similar work. So we coordinate with them on a frequent basis. NOAA, as I mentioned earlier, through the National Weather Service, we work with them very closely, particularly during response, but also in that predictive services before fires occur. And then FEMA, it's a little bit different with FEMA. We're trying to work with them closely because they have a strong role in that private lands, non-federal land side, and thinking about emergency response for wildfires. There are some hazard mitigation programs through FEMA that sort of parallel the fuels management program in the federal agencies, but again, for non-federal lands. And then they have post-fire recovery, flood recovery, some of those things, again, for private lands that we really can't do on federal land with our federal land management funds. Tribes, of course, we work closely with the Intertribal Timber Council on tribal issues. They're one of the key, it's a key priority area for tribes to protect their timber from fires. And similarly, the National Association of State Foresters. State foresters frequently, but not always, have wildfire response requirements within the states. It's again, it's not always them, but generally they're the ones that are responsible for fire response from the state perspective. So we coordinate closely with them on both the response side as well as the planning side. And then nonprofits, TNC is probably the biggest one there, but certainly not limited to just TNC. But because they have such a large prescribed fire program, we're working closely with them. And then they, through fire adapted communities and some of the state efforts, they're a key convener for us. That's it for that one. I think that's everything for us, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're happy to take your comments or questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions. So folks, feel free to unmute yourself. I see we already have a hand up. Go ahead, Madeline.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very helpful. My name is Maddie Bright. I work for FEMA Region 8's Interagency Recovery Coordination Cell. I just had a quick question about the partnerships list that you guys provided. I was curious if you were connected with, I believe they're a nonprofit organization called Fire Adapted Colorado, or FACO. Are you connected with them at all?
Indirectly, I would say that our local units through the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs work closely with many of the fire adapted coalitions, and then that's convened, funded, partially funded, or at least there's seed funding through the Nature Conservancy. I'm not familiar with that specific one, but generally that's how that works. Is we, DOI, and Forest Service, USDA, provide some funding to the Nature Conservancy. They stand up some positions who help facilitate some of those conversations, and they provide the seed money to gather folks together and think about fire adaptation. And they can be at a state level. I have a map. I'm happy to share that if there's interest of all the fire adapted communities working groups that exist at this point.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And I can post that as well on our website. I'll be posting the recording and the presentation and any other links that you think would be helpful for me to share. I don't see any other hands, but I have a question. So you mentioned with the new bill funding that there would be a grant program to non-federal. Do you have a structure for that, or how states and local governments might be able to access some of this new additional funding?
Not yet. So this is one we're coordinating with the Forest Service on, and they also received community wildfire defense grants funding. So not the same program, but similar, and they've got some existing processes that we're likely to use. I think that for the Forest Service one, they're thinking by the end of this fiscal year, so late September for us, they'll have the announcement out for their wildfire defense grants. And we're still working on the funding availability again, that because we're using so much funding for the workforce program up front, we're a little bit limited on some of the other areas at this point. So we're working to straighten that out before we can get you a time frame for when that would be available. But I'm thinking of a follow-up, how we could, because everything's still in the works.
Yeah, and we're hoping to have the Forest Service also speak in a webinar, and perhaps we could focus on that piece with them. If they're already working on that, I can check on that.
That's probably
That'd be great.
Yeah.
And Christy mentioned the slip-on tanker pilot program in that second example. Grant making is not something our program has done. So that's where we're reaching out to Forest Service as well as other partners within Interior to think about how to implement that program, that bill program.
Gotcha. Would it be required to go through a grant program, or could you do work through cooperative agreements? Those are typically a little easier to.
Yeah, I think that also was one of the possibilities being considered. Yeah. The way we're implementing it is we have different work groups among the bureaus and offices who are working with OWF staff, and they are coming up with recommendations for the Interior Fire Executive Council, or IFEC, which is sort of our leadership group. They're kind of presenting proposals to them for how to implement these things, because it is in many cases different, not fundamentally in terms of the activities, but like in this case, it's a very specific thing that Congress has to do. So there is a group, for instance, working on different ways and options that this could be implemented.
Okay, great. All right, looks like Roger has a hand up. Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, so maybe this is a follow-on to that. So that is for in the preparedness category. So that's like preparedness to put the fires out, right? Versus preparedness like under the fuels management to reduce fuels and potentially reduce risk to wildfire. Is there a grant program under that where states or communities or nonprofits or whoever could get funding to go and do some fuels management work up in and around? I'm thinking of the there's a program in Interior called the Western Watershed Protection Partnership Program, I think, and it was working with utilities to work up in the headwaters to enhance and protect their source water. So to me, source water protection in forested areas goes hand in glove with fuels management up in a forested area. So I'm wondering if there's something that might be available for utilities to or communities to get funding to do that. And it's also very much like an effort that the Yuba Water Agency that we also had a webinar on, where they got a forest resilience bond. So they went to the bond market, got a bond to do fuels management up and around their watershed and their headwaters around their reservoir. So I'm just thinking about how to, is there a program, or could there be a program with that, and kind of which category might that fit into?
So there is no program. However, some of the bureaus do what we call it community assistance. They can be grants or agreements. And the Forest Service has a much larger program. And this is where I was talking about FEMA as well. So I can't speak for FEMA, but they do have the wildfire hazard mitigation grants, and I'm not sure if that's the current or the previous program. So there's a lot more funding available for that than what we provide. Within Department of Interior, the bureaus do conduct some community assistance activities. Those can be just outreach and communications, but they do include treatments on private lands, funding for some treatments on private lands. Typically, they need to be adjacent to the federal lands in order to qualify for the requirements that allow us to provide this funding.
And there isn't any money that would go to states to do this work on state lands, or is there?
Not through DOI that I'm aware of. That those grants, those agreements can sometimes be processed by the state, though, to do work on private land. But typically not. We don't fund work on state managed land, state specific, state parks, state fish and wildlife areas, that type of work that I know of. So usually it's we might pass it through the states to private lands. Or go directly to a local community.
Looks like Maddie has a hand up too.
Yeah, sorry to chime in for a second time here, but I just wanted to expand briefly on the subject of grants for potentially like private landowners or individuals, or even private sector. I was just curious if anywhere within your program or adjacent to your program, there were any grants related to, I believe you touched on the subject earlier, but those firefighting helicopters, I guess like the scoop points or the places where they refill their water buckets. That's been an issue in a couple of our Region 8 states with like irrigation canals that get damaged, but they have a secondary purpose of being used for those aerial firefighting operations. And that's something I've been struggling to find information on. So I was just curious if you guys were aware of any resources that could support that.
Not specifically. I know that this doesn't come up often, but it has come up a few times. And that I'm aware of, we're not funding any of this work on private lands outside of when a fire actually occurs. So that there's a little bit of attention to maybe chase down there. But so within our preparedness program, we might, although again, this would be rare, set up dip sites is what we call them, but ponds, pre-established locations for water use. So dip sites on federal lands. We could also set up an agreement in advance of the fire with a private landowner or a state to utilize their water source. And so there's some possibility there. That usually only happens during suppression that I'm aware of. And sometimes it's a post facto thing. We used your water can we give it back to you? How do we, or we damaged your water container, whatever that feature is, whether it's a natural pond or something. What can we do to repair the damage after we've used it? So those are the couple of things that I'm aware of that related to it. As far as funding in advance, not that I know of.
Okay, thank you very much. The information is very helpful. Appreciate it.
All
You got
right,
another
other
one?
questions?
Yeah,
All
I
right,
got
go
another
for it.
one. I usually have a bunch. So, and I'm with EPA's Office of Water in Washington D.C., but I'm out here in California. So we're doing lots. I like your Thomas. Well, I guess I kind of like your Thomas Fire picture because that was right in my backyard. So, I thought that the Bureau of Reclamation also owned a significant amount of land in and around their reservoirs, but I didn't see them as one of your 4 bureaus. So I'm just curious on the relationship between you guys and Reclamation. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. They do, and we do have fire issues on Bureau of Reclamation lands. They have not historically been included in the Wildland Fire Program allocation, so they don't receive Wildland Fire Management Program funding. We typically, but not always, have agreements. So they don't have preparedness staff to respond. They don't have engines. They don't have those kind of resources. We do typically cover response on those Bureau of Reclamation lands through an agreement with one of the other DOI bureaus or with agriculture. So the work is happening, but they're not receiving Wildland Fire Management Program funding. We continue to have conversations. It comes up here and there about whether or not they need to, or we should, or how that might work in the future. So that could change.
There are also some active discussions related to that and infrastructure law in particular.
Yeah, because I just found the statistic I was looking for that says that they have 7.8 million acres of land and easements. So that's not too shabby. And I think you mentioned it at the beginning, but maybe not. Participation on the White House Interagency Wildfire Task Force. Are you guys the lead for Interior on that, or?
Let's see here. So I think each agency, and Stephen, if you know something different, let me know. Each agency is going to have a coordinator established, and Department of Interior has not yet established who their coordinator will be. The representation on the working group itself, the council itself, are going to be the bureau directors. So Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Bureau of Indian Affairs. Essentially, it's bureau directors that will be participating in the group itself. So no specific representation from, definitely not Stephen or I, or our office. However, I think we'll be doing a lot of support.
Great, thank you. Good questions there. Others? Roger, do you have another one? Oh, hand up. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, that was a fantastic question about Bureau of Reclamation, because that's where I work. But I just did have one follow-up. I see there's a couple other people from my office on here. And I know that our region and our office has been working on a bunch of wildland fire stuff, but the one thing that we do have is water. And so this last year, there was a lot of fires in New Mexico, and there was a lot of trying to figure out at the last minute of how to grant permission and clear reservoirs and that type of stuff that hasn't been done in the past. And so, just to kind of put that out there, that on a national level, it would be great if we had some guidance on how to do that. Obviously, our reservoirs and water rights are all very unique and tricky. But it still would be really cool to have some sort of guidance in general on how to deal with that, and maybe already have agreements set up with other interior agencies, and then also Forest Service when that water is needed.
Thank you for making a side note, and I will take that up with Laura Harger is the Bureau of Reclamation's Wildland Fire Management, I think coordinator is her title. We talk at least once a month to check in and see where things are going. So we'll talk with her about that.
Yeah,
Great,
that
thank
water
you.
rights piece is really something we haven't really delved into in this webinar series yet, and might be a good one to add as well. Seems pretty critical and complicated piece of what you work on with as far as management.
And Hannah, are you in the lower basin office or upper basin? Probably upper basin.
Upper Colorado.
Yeah.
All right, another question, a hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question. In regard to the responsibilities for the Department of Interior in regard to fee land versus easement. It's kind of a big item we're trying to tackle. I mean, obviously it's clear on fee, but do we have responsibilities to make sure we have coverage, suppression, and preventative type for all these easements we got all over the place?
I don't know. I'll just be honest. I don't know what the answer to that is. I'd have to check.
All right.
Just so I could follow up. Was it Tim? Who are you with, Tim?
Yeah, I'm with the Upper Colorado region. I work in the Realty Lands Group.
Okay, thanks.
And also the Wildlands coordinator for Upper Colorado. Just kind of new to the position, so I'm really trying to figure things out.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, and back to the water and availability aspect. You mentioned about ensuring that you're not spreading invasives. So is that work with GS that you identify what invasives might be in a? Can't imagine that happens when you're in the throes of a fire. You go, wait, let's see what's in it first. But so is that part of the assessment through GS, or what information do you use to make those determinations about, I guess, suitable water?
Anything we can get a hold of. So sincerely, it's actually one of the more challenging. Well, gosh, there's lots of challenges. It's a challenging question. So there's an interagency working group, or there was through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, and each of the 5 federal agencies, again, that doesn't include BOR, who are really working on wildfire issues, got together and coordinated on an aquatic invasive species management, not strategy. That's really tactics. Identified aquatic invasive species, worked to identify where some data sources were. They leverage individual agencies, land management agencies tend to have pretty good maps sometimes of what's good and what's not. But cross-boundary, a full-scale national map, it'd be great to bring all that information together in one place. And to my knowledge, it tends to be real point data versus thinking about whole reaches of streams or above and below streams. And that's that kind of information.
Yeah, we've got invasive species. I thought we had a task force, but I'll look into it because I think a lot of that work is, I won't say already done, but really underway, and there's lots of them, and even at the state level, they're looking at it as well. But I'm not sure if it gets into reservoirs and irrigation canals and ponds that you might be dipping from. But if I can try to find something and send it to you all, so that way you have resources outside of your little group that could be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you.
Not that your group is little, just.
It's okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
To follow up on that, on the water reservoir side, we also had concerns this past summer of crews coming in that weren't Forest Service. I think they were contractors from random little town in Wyoming type of thing, and trying to figure out how we can best protect the reservoir from getting invasive species from other places. And that also, I mean, I think that we locked something down, found some sort of guidance, but again, just kind of more on that national level of like, this is what we should be doing to protect both, you know, the water in the reservoir, as well as if there are aquatic invasive species or whatever in the water, from spreading it out onto the land.
Yes. Yeah. Very good point. And this is, again, it's a challenging issue. We have guidance available for how to address this. I think sometimes we need to make sure we're enforcing our guidance, but or ensuring that folks are aware that it exists as well. So it sounds like you've already found it, but I'm happy to share the aquatic invasive species guide for transport for wildland fire with you that does exist with the whole group. So
yeah,
I'll
I would like to look at that, because I off the top of my head, I can't remember what we were using, but we did find something, and I don't know if it was old or something new, or so I would definitely like to take a look at that.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll make sure and get that shared. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'll post that as well. All right, well, we've used up all our time here, but if there's no other additional questions, and I don't see any hands raised, we'll conclude today. I just want to thank everybody for joining, and especially to Stephen and Christy for this great presentation and good discussion. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Thanks for having
you.
us.
Goodbye.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thank
Bye.
you.